friends, it's Jess with Virtually Visual, and today I'm finally back with another tutorial. They're going to dive into kind of art directing some cloth and creating just kind of a fun abstract simulation here. This is a pretty easy effect to achieve, so I'm excited for something a little bit more beginner friendly today. And yeah, it should be really fun, so let's dive right in. So what I'm planning to do here is we're going to have an object in the center of our scene, and we're going to have cloth kind of floating around it, similar to a shot that I put on my Instagram. I had this like product animation that I did for my work. For that, I just had like a card in the center of the screen, almost like a credit card type of thing, and then the cloth was animating around it. But in our case, I thought it'd be fun to do something different, so we're going to do a vase. And we're going to make a vase with the spline and some sweeping and lathing and that kind of thing. So we can actually hide our backdrop for right now, but let's bring in a figure object kind of for scale reference. Go up here to this window and we're going to find empty spline. We can just pull that right in. And I'm actually going to click this little icon on the top right, and that will bring me into my 4 displays here. So we have different angles. And I'm just going to go right to front because I want to make sure that I'm getting this directly in the front view without any weird angles in my spline as I'm creating. So I'm still selected on that spline, and now I'm going to go click on this spline pen option on the left, and now we can start clicking and creating our general half outline of our vase shape. I'm going to start at the center, and I'm going to drag this out maybe to right here, and I'm going to drag it up straight up a little bit so we create kind of an edge there. And now I'm actually going to create the curve of our vase. So maybe I want to click out here and something like that. So I might add a point here, and I kind of want another here, and maybe one more here before I go, and we'll go here first, and then maybe something like this. Once you have a shape that you like overall, let's hit Control A and we can select all of our points. And then we're going to right click and we're going to go to Create Outline. If we click that and then we have a change in our cursor, we can start to drag and we will be creating our outline here, which is what we want. So I'm going to go to maybe about there, and then cursor here on the select, and we might need to alter some of these points a little bit just because they're intersecting up here. So I'm going to go back to my pen tool, start messing with these handles. So now when we have this double line like this, we can click back on that 4 view icon. Let's go back to perspective view. And then we can finally grab our lathe, and then you can pull your spline into that and it will create a vase. So I think that's kind of cool, and we've got a really fun shape here. So I like that. I think it's awesome. So you could just right click and then hit current state to object, but something I want to do to ensure our geometry is pretty nice is pulling this into a volume builder and volume mesher. And if you've never used the volume builder, don't be afraid of it. The volume builder is just going to turn things into voxels, which are like these big chunky blocks. So if we take this down to like 4, big a voxel size right now for this to look proper. So you can decrease the voxel size. You could also hold down on this SDF smooth, and there's this dilate and erode option, so that could also help bring in some thickness back. And then once you have the shape that you actually like, then you can pull in an SDF smooth, and that should take out some of the harsh edges that you may have. Then if you kind of want to see where your mesh density is, you can hit N and B on your keyboard, and by plugging the volume builder into the volume mesher, it creates an actual mesh for us. Without it, it is just going to be these boxy voxels. So we get this mesh, but it's not super symmetrical and it's not very optimized. So you can fix that by pulling in a remesh. And I'm going to take this adaptiveness down, and I'm going to set this to symmetric on the x-axis and the z-axis. And then we can pull our volume mesher right in there. And it shouldn't change the actual density other than just changing how symmetrical it is and how it will now use quads. So that changes there, but if we wanted less density, we could also set this to maybe 50%, and we'll have a little bit more optimized mesh. But for now, we'll just call that good. So I'm gonna go connect objects and delete, and then rename this to vase. And it's a little large, so I'm going to go into the object mode and hit T and scale this down. And then I'm also going to go to Tools, Axis, Center Axis 2, and that should just put my axis right in the center of this face. And we could even maybe bring back in our backdrop and delete our figure. Okay, so now I want there to be splines that kind of flow around our vase, just kind of in the foreground and background. I think it'd be fun to kind of maybe have one wrap around the vase or like kind of flow around it. And then maybe we just have another one flowing in the background. So we're going to use splines again, because this is just a good building block for us. And you can use spline for a lot of different things. And in our case, splines can act as a guide for where we're going to have the cloth move. So I'm going to go back into this 4 window view, and we're going to go back to front, because we're going to be creating some kind of wavy lines first for the background cloth to follow. So I'm going to go back to that empty spline here, and then we're going to go back to our pen tool, and let's create that first kind of wavy shape. So I'm actually going to click here, I'm going to click here, and then I'm going to create something like this shape, just clicking and dragging and trying to keep kind of few points as possible, because that just makes it easier to work with. Something like that, and then I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and I just want to continue this line, and I'm also going to click this line here, and I want to extend this a lot. I want both of these to be pretty far off the edges of our backdrop, and I'll explain a little bit more on why in a little bit. So this is our background spline, so I'm going to name that background spline, and then we can hide that for now. Let's go back to our perspective view. For the spline that we want to wrap around the vase, we can actually use something that already exists to start. So if we go back to the spline section, we can use a helix, and this will be set to kind of a spiral as is. So I'm going to change this to XZ mode to be up and down like this, and we can start playing with the radiuses here. I think if we set this maybe a little bit over here, and I think that's a fine radius, so we could set both to 55. I think it's kind of more interesting if it changes, so maybe something less, or so something like that. And then you could play with the height bias to kind of distribute where you want the main curves to be. I might rotate this though a bit, where we can keep tweaking our settings as far as the radius goes. But let's hit C on that helix we were designing, and we now have made this editable. So now we can't edit those spline options that we had for the helix. So just make sure that you're ready to hit that when the time comes, and know that you can't edit this again. That's also why I made a copy, just in case. But the thing that makes it hard about manipulating this spline now is that it has way too many points. So how do we go about fixing that? If you actually hit Shift C on your keyboard, you can search for different things if you've never done that before. And you can actually search for resample, and you have this option to resample splines. So we can actually pull that in, and let's drag that under our helix. You can actually change the count size and set this to whatever number you are most comfortable with wanting to manipulate when we want to move points around, or if you want to move points around. So I think 10 for my case works just fine. That seems like a perfect amount, where I've lowered the point significantly from the original shape, but I've still got enough that I can manipulate, and it seems much more manageable. So the thing we need to do now is we're going to right click on our helix, and we're going to set current state to object. It's going to create a new copy. So we can delete this one from before, and we have our blocky spline here. So we need to do 2 things now in the object window here. We need to change the type from linear to B-spline, or whatever one of these you'd prefer, and then you need to change the interpolation to adaptive. So you can see we have the point still in here, but it has now smoothed out this curve. So you can also play with some of these other ones. You can do uniform as well, natural, subdivided. Any of these seem to work. I just chose adaptive. And then if you try these different shapes, Bezier might actually be more natural to how our original helix was, so maybe I'll keep it there. But we tried B-spline, Akima also works, cubic works. So yeah, we have cubic and Bezier are probably almost exactly the same, so I'll just keep it on Bezier. And again, you can see that now we have this shape here. But I am noticing that this might be a little bit too close on the side of our helix, so I'm going to just move this over, and you can see now we have our cloth guide here. But again, like the background spline stuff, we need to kind of extend the spline in the beginning and ending, so that our cloth kind of has a further out starting point when it is wrapping around. And I'm also going to drag this upwards a little. So we're going to click on the first point, and I'm going to click out here and just create a point. Then I'm going to click off, we select our last point now, and we're going to zoom out a bit, and we're going to create another point here. So now we can kind of just move these around as looks best. Something like that will do. And okay, now we can actually start working with the splines that we have. Let's also make sure that our background spline is not in the center because it'll intersect with everything else. So I'm going to move this towards the back, and that's probably good. Maybe, yeah, I think that's fine. Let's work with one at a time. So I'm going to focus on our background spline first just because it's easier. So I'm going to actually hide our vase as well. So the key to this effect is actually just really straightforward. It's using the spline wrap. So we're going to go and we're going to grab a spline wrap. Actually, let's grab two because we'll eventually need to use one for the other cloth as well. We're going to need an object that we want to use the spline wrap on. So I'm going to create a plane, and this is going to be our cloth. Let's hide the backdrop for the moment. And we will hide the spline wrap. So if we hit NB in our keyboard on this plane, we can see all the vertices that are on here. And I'm going to actually go back to the object view too, because then we'll get the little yellow dots to control the size. So I'm going to make this plane arrow like this, and I'm going to increase the height and lower this width a bit. And then it has pretty low mesh density, so I'm going to increase the height and width segments, maybe 20 on the height, and then let's go up to 100 for the segments on the width. And this is going to be our cloth that wraps around this background spline here. We are going to put the spline wrap under the plane, and then we're going to drag this down so it's underneath our background spline, just so we're kind of organized here. And now if we click on our spline wrap, let's call this background spline wrap, we have a spline, a rail section, and all this other stuff. The only one we really need to worry about here is spline, so we can drag our background spline in there. And right away, it's going to change the shape of our plane. It's going to kind of wrap it like this, which is really cool, but not really what we're going for. So you can go into this rotation section and start turning this 90 degrees. So once we do that, it should be now following the shape we want. However, it looks crunchy and jagged because it is stretching the plane to the entire length of the spline, and we don't want that. So you can actually change that by going to Fit Spline and setting Keep Length. So now you can actually mess with this offset, and it'll start putting that cloth plane around the spline correctly. However, this is actually pointing in an incorrect way, so we actually do need the x-axis. Sometimes it's worth just playing around with all of these and seeing a mode that you like. But one other thing I want to note here is the up vectors. Sometimes when using spline wrap, you have stuff that kind of flickers around when it's moving if you use this. So it's worth adding some up vectors, changing these to like 1 or 2. You notice that the offset value will change where the whole plane goes, so it follows the length of the spline, animates it correctly. However, you can also play with this to and from value. So if you play with the from value, that's going to push the plane along the spline, but it's also shrinking this. So you can do the same thing with the to value. If you play with that, it'll kind of squish the plane the opposite direction. So if one thing you can do when animating this piece of cloth is you can also play with this value to add some extra movement to your cloth in the scene. So the main way we're going to create this effect is adding a keyframe for offset at 0, and then let's go to 90 frames, and let's take this all the way up to 100. So let's just see what that looks like by default. So it looks like that, pretty cool. The other thing we want to change is that right now these keyframes are easy easing. They are not constant, they speed up in the middle. So I actually don't want that. So I'm gonna click on my keyframe at the beginning and just change this to linear. And now it should be a constant movement here, a little bit slower, which is what we want. We're gonna leave that as is for now. And let's create a copy of our plane. And we can delete the background spline wrap. But let's grab the second one that we pulled in, and we'll call this one cloth spline wrap. And let's now bring back in our cloth wrap spline, and let's group the background stuff into its own null just so we can kind of organize this better. So I'll call that background, and I'll hide that for now so we can just focus on this one. So okay, I'm going to zoom in a bit here. And for this one, let's pull in the cloth wrap spline into the target spline area. And again, let's change this to keep length. And this is where we might need to play with the size of this particular plane. So I'm actually going to shorten this a bit. I'm going to change the width as well. I want this to be much thinner. Let's also bring back in our vase. So this time, let's animate again, 0 for the offset there, and we'll take this to 100%. And we may need to also try playing with the to and from offset this time, because I don't want it to be showing in the scene when I add a camera until like midway through maybe. So this might be a little bit too close. So let me zoom in here. I'm going to play with the to value. So I'm going to set this maybe to 36%, and then maybe at 30, I'm going to extend this to 100. So let's see what that looks like. And I also am seeing that I think this cloth, I want it to be rotated when it actually goes around the vase. So I might actually change this value to 90 as well. I think I may need to make the plane thinner yet again. So let's just check that right now. I think that's cool. So let's just start adding some cloth dynamics and seeing what this looks like. Let's actually hide the splines just from the viewport. We can pull our backdrop back in here. Hit NA on my keyboard to get rid of the wireframe view. I'm going to do a couple things first. I'm going to add a collider tag to my vase so that other dynamics interact with it. So you can find that in simulation tags, collider. And I'm going to turn off bounce, and I'm going to turn off friction for now. We may change that later. And then I'm going to click on both of my planes, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to hit simulation tags cloth. And I'm going to leave all the settings as default just for right now so we can see what that's like. But before I hit play, I'm going to hit Control D on my keyboard, and this will bring up the project settings. And I'm going to go to the simulation tab, scene, and this is where we can play with the gravity. So I'm going to turn that off because I do not want my cloth to fall at all. And if we were to just hit play, actually, these cloths won't go anywhere. So yeah, nothing happens. They're just kind of frozen in time. So we actually need to change that. And the way you can make cloth follow any kind of keyframe animation that you've made is by going to mix animation. And if you either do with pins or with force, you'll start to see them follow the keyframes you made. So I'm going to try setting this to 20% for both for now. Let's just see what we get. It's already kind of cool. But one thing I forgot to do is to make the keyframes for the cloth wrap linear. And let's see, maybe we want to extend this to frame 50. So I think I'm going to extend my timeline to maybe 200. And I'm going to find our keyframe at 90. And I'm going to move this to, I think, 150. And same for the cloth spline wrap. Let's move that keyframe to 150 as well. So let's see what we get now for that background spline. So I think that is probably much better. Okay, so yeah, I think the keyframe didn't correctly animate to linear for our cloth wrap one around the vase. So I think that's fixed now, and both of these look pretty good. You may also notice the cloth wrapping one kind of sticks in place when it hits 150. Stop that weird pending happening, we need to go to mix animation, hit a keyframe for the influence, and keep that at 20 there, and then we'll go to frame 150. And we're going to set this to 0 keyframe, and let's check that out now. Yep, so if you play with the keyframing and strength of the pinning that you have in mix animation or force, whichever one you go for, that should prevent your cloth from just kind of sticking to a certain area and looking kind of funky. Yeah, that's really kind of how you get the cloth to kind of be art directed a little bit. Okay, so now we can go back to our camera and kind of make sure our framing is nice. So I'm gonna go to midway through our scene, maybe like right here. And this is where we can now kind of tweak our camera and whatnot. So I'm actually going to bring the focal length all the way up to 200, I think. And I'm going to kind of lower our angle and zoom in here. This might even be something where we want to add a platform of sorts for our vase to be sitting on. So I'm really liking it. I do think it is a little fast maybe. So what we could do is play with the time scale a bit, and then one at a time we're going to bake these as an alembic. Okay, so if you want to play with like some slow motion, the way we need to do this is we need to uncheck use animation, and I added a keyframe for frame 0 for both of the alembics, and then you want to find the point where you want the slow motion to start. So let's say frame 60, and you want to enter that same frame right there. So frame 60, let's add a keyframe, and it'll be the actual frame 60. But this is where we want slow motion to start. So let's go to the end now. Actually, maybe we can go to frame 120, and let's say we only want this to progress to frame 80 at this point. Our final keyframe here, so maybe we want to do 100. Let's see if that helps. So we have our scene as is, and I think this is really cool just to get some slow motion movement in there. And again, we've art directed our cloth. Yeah, we've got the scene, and this is really interesting, but I do want to make it one step more interesting by adding some camera movement. And there is actually a really easy way, and that is by utilizing the time track. So this comes into play after you keyframe. So let's animate our camera a little bit first, and then I'll show you how to make the time track. So we'll keyframe at 90. I think that's a good kind of middle point. And I'm going to go to 0, and I'm going to kind of angle this where I want. So maybe like here. I'm going to zoom in a bit, and let's add another keyframe on our camera. And then we'll go to the end, and maybe we'll angle this upwards this time like that. So they're just kind of going to speed up in between each keyframe and slow at each keyframe, which is not what I want. The way we're going to add this camera magic is by right-clicking on our camera and go add special track, time track. And it's going to create this new time track, which has its own linear constant line, and this represents how time moves with your keyframes. So it's set to constant. We want to set this to easy ease, and then I'm actually going to drag both of these points. I want to also make this a little bit easier for me to view. So let's change this here. Something like that. I want to make sure the middle area does not get kind of weird. I want it to be staying horizontal, and I don't want these hills to kind of cross over that. So something about here works. But I want this start to be fast, and I want the end to be fast. So nothing will happen by default. So we can play this, and it should be the exact same as before when it was easy eased. But what we need to do now is highlight all of our positional and rotation keyframes, and there's this area called time track, and it's looking for a time track there. So we can just drag our time track, and now it will use that specific timing with our keyframes. So if we play now, you can see it's coming into effect. So it is working correctly. Yeah, so that's how we do our fun camera motion. So now we're just going to create a few little materials, and we should be good to go. Create standard for the vase. Call it vase. And create another material. Call this cloth wrap, and one more. I'll call this background or back cloth. Okay, so let's start with the vase. I'm first going to focus on creating kind of the roughness surface. So I'm going to add a bump map, and I'm going to create a max on noise and set this in here, and I'm going to use the, I think, Voronoi 2, or it might be displaced Voronoi, and I'm just going to solo that, and then while that's soloed, let's pull up the render view. And we also want to add an HDRI. Let's revisit our node editor, and in the max on noise, I want to take this size way down. So maybe 10, maybe even less. Maybe, well, let's try 5 for now. And I'm going to change the exponent, maybe the cycles value up, I think. Just trying to play with this to get kind of a like stippled structure like that. Let's also rotate our light, and I'm going to set the material to be rough. So you can see we've got a cool texture there already, and I'm going to change this color to maybe some kind of a orangey color. And then I also kind of want to add a fun little pattern. So I'm going to add a color layer, and I'm going to add a ramp, And I'm just going to try to add a pattern to the middle of the vase. So the way we're going to do that is by using our ramp, and let's really bring these notches in. I really want the middle to be the only thing that we have visible. So I'm also going to add another ramp for black here, and then a copy of white over here. So I think that right there is good. So this is going to act as a mask. I think we could pull in tiles, and we could do something. You could choose a pattern here to plug in to the color section. So if we do that, then solo this, you're going to see that pattern only shows up there. So we could also set our base color as a same color that we have in our terracotta, and then we'll get that. So maybe we want to go to tiles. Let's change these to black and white, or whatever colors you're feeling. And then we can change this pattern. Okay, and then we could plug that into the color of our material. And now we should have something a little bit more interesting there. But again, and then you can go into the tiles node and set this to kind of anything from here. So I think that's really cool, actually. I kind of want to keep that. Now we can create our cloth material. So I'm going to pull our cloth wrap onto our cloth, and then the back one onto the background cloth. And let's just head to our frame that we want here. A tiles node again. Set our colors to black and white. And then let's solo this. See that scale. And I'm going to take the scale way down and start playing with the UV scale. This to be really small. And then I'm going to plug this into the opacity of our cloth. And that's going to make this kind of a sheer see-through texture, which will increase your render time, so just be wary of that. If you wanted to make it a little bit easier on you, you could plug that then into a ramp and kind of crank the white values down a little bit, so it'll make it a little bit less transparent but still have elements of that in there. And then we could also throw in a new ramp. This will drive our color, and maybe we want a max on noise that we plug in there. And we could pick a preset here, so maybe we want like supersonic, and I'm going to plug this into color for now, but I am going to put a color correct node in there, and I'm going to lower the saturation, or I'm going to bring the hue to something different. Yeah, so this is definitely an option. I actually don't know if I want to do a pattern just because of we've got a cool pattern going on with the vase, and we could actually just reuse that material for our back cloth if we wanted. And finally, I'm just going to add the redshift object tag onto both of the cloth, and I'm going to override the tessellation in our geometry section and uncheck screen space adaptive. And it should kind of smooth out any harsh edges we have in our cloth material. And yeah, maybe I'll just play with some materials for our vase. One quick thing I will just cover also is just how to add a just satisfying ramp to your cloth. So we can just solo this ramp on our actual main cloth that's wrapping around the vase, and we can just play around with this mapping. So if we set this to horizontal, it will just map along the length of the cloth. So what we can do is we can add multiple points in here, then we can play with these colors. Yeah, that's kind of nice. I think the thing that the scene is currently missing is some more lighting catching the back of the vase. So we're going to add a backlight, which is just an area light, and then I'm going to put my camera in here, but then exit out of it in my viewport so I can see where I'm moving. And I'm going to plug this towards the back and rotate this around so it's facing our vase and cloth. And I'm going to drag this to the right and then angle this as well. And the final thing I might recommend is adding some motion blur. So I like to go to render settings, redshift, motion blur, and we're going to enable motion blur, set this maybe to 3 steps, and set the shutter time down to like 20, and just give that a whirl. So you won't see it in this view. You have to turn on, I think, bucket to see it, or render a sample shot out. I'm going to render a shot right now. Cool, so we've got some motion blur in the background, primarily on our faster moving background cloth, but there is some slight motion blur on our cloth wrapping one. And again, because we have slow motion, the motion blur might not be interacting all that much here, but just know that you can get lots of motion blur if you have kind of normal speed, or you can just mess with those motion blur settings in the render settings. So yeah, that was it for this tutorial today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed learning how to kind of art direct cloth using splines and spline wrap, and then also how to make just like your own vases with the lathe and some more splines, and set up just kind of some fun materials. So kind of simple, straightforward, a little bit of a longer video for kind of beginner friendly techniques, but hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching. See ya.